The Yalta Conference, held from February 4 to 11, 1945, was a seminal event in the history of the 20th century. This meeting brought together three of the most powerful leaders of the time: Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom; Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States; and Joseph Stalin, Premier of the Soviet Union. The conference was convened at the Levadia Palace near Yalta in Crimea to discuss the reorganization of Europe following the anticipated defeat of Nazi Germany. The decisions made during this conference not only shaped the geopolitical landscape of the post-war world but also laid the groundwork for the Cold War. Background and context. As World War II approached its final stages, the Allied leaders recognized the need to discuss the future of Europe and the world. The war had wrought unparalleled destruction, particularly in Europe, and the Allied powers had the daunting task of rebuilding and reshaping the continent. The Yalta Conference was the second of three major wartime conferences among the Big Three leaders, following the Tehran Conference in 1943 and preceding the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. By the time of the Yalta Conference, the Allies had achieved several key victories, and the defeat of Nazi Germany seemed imminent. However, there were still significant military operations underway, and the leaders needed to coordinate their final assaults on Germany. Additionally, the Allies had to address the political vacuum that would result from the collapse of the Axis powers. Key participants: Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, was deeply concerned about the balance of power in Europe, particularly the threat posed by the Soviet Union's expanding influence. Churchill aimed to secure a post-war order that would protect British interests and prevent the spread of communism. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the American president, was focused on creating a stable and lasting peace through the establishment of international institutions. Roosevelt's vision included the creation of the United Nations to foster global cooperation and prevent future conflicts. He also sought Soviet participation in the war against Japan, which was still ongoing. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet premier's primary goal was to secure the Soviet Union's western borders and establish a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Stalin was determined to ensure that the Soviet Union would emerge from the war as a dominant global power, with secure borders and friendly governments in neighboring countries. Major decisions and agreements. The Yalta Conference resulted in several key agreements and decisions that would shape the post-war world. These can be categorized into military, political, and territorial arrangements. 1. Military coordination. One of the primary military concerns was the coordination of the final assaults on Nazi Germany. The Allies agreed on the necessity of a concerted effort to hasten the end of the war in Europe. They discussed the timing and strategy for the final push into Germany, with particular focus on the eastern and western fronts. 2. Division of Germany. A major topic of discussion was the future of Germany. The leaders agreed that Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones, each controlled by one of the Allied powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France. Berlin, the capital, would also be divided into 4 sectors, despite being located deep within the Soviet zone. This division aimed to prevent any resurgence of German militarism and to allow for the demilitarization and denazification of Germany. 3. Poland and Eastern Europe. Poland was a contentious issue at Yalta. The pre-war Polish government, which had been in exile in London, was opposed by the Soviet-backed Lublin Committee, which claimed to represent the Polish people. The leaders agreed on the reorganization of the Polish government to include members from both groups, and they recognized the need for free and fair elections. However, the borders of Poland were redrawn, with significant territorial shifts. The Curzon Line was accepted as the eastern border of Poland, while Poland was compensated with territories in the west, taken from Germany. 4. The United Nations. The establishment of the United Nations was one of Roosevelt's primary goals. The Yalta Conference saw significant progress towards this end, with the leaders agreeing on the structure of the UN Security Council. It was decided that the Security Council would have 5 permanent members: the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, China, and France, each with veto power. This structure was intended to ensure the participation and cooperation of the major powers in maintaining global peace and security. 5. Soviet entry into the war against Japan. Roosevelt was keen to secure Soviet participation in the war against Japan, which was still raging in the Pacific. At Yalta, Stalin agreed to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat. In return, the Soviet Union was promised territories in Asia, including the southern part of Sakhalin Island, the Kuril Islands, and influence in Manchuria. This agreement was seen as crucial for hastening the end of the war in the Pacific. Implications and consequences. The decisions made at the Yalta Conference had far-reaching implications for the post-war world and the onset of the Cold War. While the conference achieved significant cooperation among the Allies, it also sowed the seeds of future conflicts and divisions. 1. The division of Europe. The agreements made at Yalta effectively divided Europe into spheres of influence, with the Western Allies controlling the western part of the continent and the Soviet Union dominating the East. This division was a precursor to the Iron Curtain, a term coined by Churchill to describe the ideological and physical boundary that would come to separate the Soviet bloc from the West. The division of Germany and Berlin would later become a focal point of Cold War tensions, culminating in the Berlin blockade and the construction of the Berlin Wall. 2. The fate of Poland. The fate of Poland became a symbol of the broader East-West conflict. Despite the promise of free elections, the Soviet Union established a communist government in Poland, effectively absorbing it into its sphere of influence. This betrayal of the Yalta agreements was a source of deep resentment in the West and among the Polish people. It highlighted the competing visions for post-war Europe and the difficulty of reconciling them. 3. The United Nations. The creation of the United Nations was one of the lasting achievements of the Yalta Conference. The UN would play a crucial role in international diplomacy and conflict resolution in the post-war era. However, the veto power granted to the permanent members of the Security Council often led to deadlock during the Cold War, as the United States and the Soviet Union frequently used their vetoes to block each other's initiatives. 4. The Cold War. The Yalta Conference is often seen as a turning point in the emergence of the Cold War. The ideological differences between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, which had been temporarily set aside during the war, became starkly apparent in the post-war period. The competition for influence in Europe and the rest of the world led to a prolonged period of geopolitical tension, characterized by proxy wars, nuclear arms race, and a constant threat of global conflict. Conclusion. The Yalta Conference was a critical moment in the history of the 20th century, marking the transition from World War II to the Cold War. The decisions made at Yalta shaped the geopolitical landscape of the post-war world, establishing the framework for the division of Europe and the creation of international institutions like the United Nations. While the conference succeeded in fostering cooperation among the Allies to bring about the end of the war, it also laid the groundwork for future conflicts and divisions. The legacy of Yalta is complex, reflecting both the aspirations for a peaceful and cooperative post-war order and the realities of power politics and ideological conflict. The conference underscored the difficulty of reconciling different visions for the future and the challenges of establishing a lasting peace in a world marked by deep-seated rivalries and competing interests. As such, the Yalta Conference remains a pivotal event in understanding the dynamics of the post-war world and the origins of the Cold War.